Welcome to the second part of the first multi-part analysis of a single poem in the series Du Fu Explained. We are dealing here with one of the monuments of Du Fu's catalog, 自京赴奉先县咏怀五百字. In the last video, which I'm sure you have seen before you jump into this one, I talked about the first third of this poem, more or less, from the beginning until this line. All of that was about Du Fu himself. He was talking about himself, his ambitions, and so on. In this part, the middle third of the poem, he is going to be talking about, well, actually what is in the title. He's setting out on his travels, and he describes what he passes on the way. So let's get right into it. He starts by describing a winter scene. 岁暮百草林，疾风高冈烈. Not really much to talk about here, language-wise. 岁暮, as I said, it's at the end of the year. 天曲阴峥嵘，客自中夜发. Here it is already much less conventional, and it is typical of Du Fu, of course, that he usually doesn't make do with conventional descriptions, and this is no exception here. The first line I find is just extraordinary. 天曲阴峥嵘. What is this? Well, 天曲, heavenly avenues. 曲 is a great thoroughfare, a large type of road. The royal avenues. Owen thinks in the translation that the Tianqu are the avenues of heaven, that is the avenues of Chang'an, so Tianqu would then be Chang'an, and it is in Chang'an that the shadows are deep. But really though, I'm not sure why it has to be Chang'an. Why can't it just be heaven? Tianqu is a piece of vocabulary that comes straight out of the I Ching, and I think it's thinking back on that suggestive sort of concentrated language that is used in the I Ching. I think Tianqu, the road of heaven, as a description of heaven itself, of the sort of the route that the year travels, and now being in the deepest part of the yin section, because we are in the middle of winter, so the yin energies, the dark energies, are preponderant. Tianqu, I think, could just as well refer to that, to the natural environment. And then yin zhengrong. This is so wonderful. Zhengrong is so cool. Zhengrong, of course, is a very common word. It means more or less like towering, lofty, and steep, as a mountain is. But Du Fu uses it here as an adjective to describe yin, which is really cool. I mean, yin is the shadows, the dark, and calling the dark towering and jagged and steep like a mountain is a very interesting way of describing the cold, describing the dark, the energies of winter. And I think, of course, it has this. I mean, when you say zhengrong, it sounds like deep in, sunk deep in. So this would be sort of a way of describing the way that shadow can be layered on shadow. But I think zhengrong, it has a distinct, connotation of cold. A warm shadow could never be described like this. Yin zhengrong really has to be a very cold shadow. So that's what this means. 客子, the traveler, that's Du Fu himself. He sets forth at midnight. 双眼衣带断，只直不得及. So 双眼, now we are back in more sort of very realistic writing, which is like, that's how Du Fu works in this longer sort of poems. He sometimes goes for like purely descriptive things, and sometimes it's interspersed with more symbolic language, more sort of metaphoric language. Here he's very realistic and straightforward. 双眼, the frost is harsh, and his coat sash is snapped. Probably it's been frozen, so it snaps easily, and his fingers are still so stiff that he can't tie, the belt or the sash that has snapped, something like that. Yes, wonderful. Now he's reaching, or he's passing by the place on his travels, or the place that he's passing by, which most of this section concerns. Lishan, Mount Li. 凌晨过骊山，欲踏在敌聂. So he's presumably been on his way for a few hours, and now he's coming to Mount Li. Mount Li, if you have been to Xi'an and visited the Terracotta Army, perhaps you noticed, or perhaps you didn't, that you passed by a place called Lishan. Lishan is sort of a mountainous area to the east, I would say, probably east, yeah, to the east of Chang'an, and it was famous for its hot springs. So there are hot springs in this place, and emperors of every dynasty really used it as his spa retreat, really. So Xuanzong, the emperor in Du Fu's time, he built a palace there, and he spent the winters there. And it's also known that the emperor was there when he got the news of An Lushan's rebellion. So Du Fu is not just guessing that the emperor is there. At this time, it was very much known, and he built really a huge palace around. He's supposed to have built a really huge palace around this area, and it was closed off, cordoned off for like miles, where no mortal would ever, of course, no mortal would be allowed to set his foot there. By mortal, of course, I mean common man. And the news of the An Lushan rebellion, as you know, probably reached the emperor around this time, really. So the emperor is in the palace, and Du Fu passes by on his way, and sometime just around this time, the emperor is receiving news that one of his generals, one of the most important generals, has rebelled, and this has started a war, really. And Du Fu is not aware of this when he writes, but it seems the whole atmosphere of this poem still sort of reeks with this historical background, and the urgency and this sort of burning intensity of Du Fu's worries and concerns in this poem seem almost prophetic. It seems to portend what is about to happen, and since I am a great believer in the medium-like qualities of great poets, I am sure that this is not a coincidence. So he's been on his way for a few hours, and now he passes by Lishan, and Yu Ta, the royal couch, is there. Yu Ta, it's strange, like couch here. Ta, it means really couch, as in sofa. So the royal couch, I don't know if this refers to the furniture inside of the palace, or if it refers to his carriage or anything like that. But anyway, it's on the towering height. Dianir, a really weird word. Dianir, one of a billion Chinese words, it seems, that means a high mountain or describes a high mountain. Du Fu goes on describing the scene. 蚩尤塞寒空，蹴踏崖谷华. This first line is very much debated, so we have to talk about this for a while. 蚩尤塞寒空, stuff the cold sky. 塞寒空, well, at least that is not strange. What about 蚩尤? Ill-omened auroras. Is that an adequate translation? Let's go into that. 蚩尤, as many of you probably know, he's a figure of Chinese mythology. He was the great antagonist of the Yellow Emperor in the most ancient of ancient antiquity. Likely, actually, modern scholars would say that this is a truly archaic god. It's perhaps he's perhaps of non-Chinese origin, to the extent that such a designation is meaningful in prehistory. Anyway, he had this war with Huangdi, with the Yellow Emperor, and in his major showdown with Huangdi, he caused a great fog to arise, and that's really the simple explanation here. So the simple explanation is that Du Fu uses the story of the great fog during the battle with the Yellow Emperor. So that's why he uses 蚩尤 to describe the fog. And that's, I think, probably the easiest way to describe to explain the line. It seems to fit in well with this sai. Sai seems to be a very reasonable word, a verb to use if you want to describe what fog does. Well, it fills out the sky in a sort of stuffing manner, so that seems reasonable. But that's not the whole story, of course, because 蚩尤, he is a god of war, specifically, and he was worshipped by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, for example. And the fact that he is a god of war, I think that is very fitting here. And it's perhaps more fitting than Du Fu knows consciously. Because, as I said, the whole atmosphere of the whole poem feels full of these portents. Owen goes with auroras, and he says ill-omened auroras, because of, he does that for another reason. It's because there is the ancient tradition of qi watching, qi xiangxue, where men trained in this discipline go out and look at the qi of a place, the qi being sort of the material energy, everything that you're able to perceive with your senses about a place. And within qi watching, there is something called 蚩尤旗, 蚩尤 banners, and that would be sort of a banner-like wavy formation of the qi, which would be an ill omen then. And that's what Du Fu goes with here. So auroras, though I really can't imagine auroras being, literal auroras being very common in the Xi'an region. It's too far south. But anyway, there is a lot of debate about this among commentators. Likely there's a whole section in the notes to this poem in my edition which deals with the various theories about this. So I just summarized that for you now, because it's very original to describe, to write like this, and there is no real precedent for it. 促踏崖谷滑, because they have trampled the slippery valley slopes. I don't know how an aurora exactly tramples slippery valley slopes. It seems more reasonable to me to say that Du Fu is the one who is trampling the valley slopes, and they are slippery. Perhaps because 蚩尤 means fog, so I'm mostly inclined to go with a fog explanation for this. Anyway, it's very suggestive and a very interesting way of writing, because if you want to say that, well, fog fills the air, but it's also the god of war that fills the air. There's such a nice possibility here for a double understanding that enriches it much more than 2 times. Let's go on. 瑶池气玉缕, 雨林香魔甲. Vapors surge swelling from alabaster pool. Yao Chi is alabaster pool. I've talked about this in the analysis to another poem. It's the story of King Mu of Zhou, who visits the Queen Mother of the East on Kunlun Mountain, where there is a pool called the Alabaster Pool, where he was allowed to bathe, I suppose, and they feasted by the shores of Alabaster Pool, Yao Chi. So it's a metaphor for it's Du Fu's little epithet for the hot springs of Lishan. And of course, In the comparison, the Queen Mother of the West would of course be Yang Guifei, the favorite concubine of Xuanzong, and in popular consciousness, of course, the major cause of the empire's downfall, because it always has to be a sinful woman, and perhaps it frequently is, I'm not sure. 瑶池气玉缕, 玉缕 is an adjective which describes the billowing of steam. And 羽林香魔甲, 羽林香魔甲, the royal guardsman, Owen says 羽林, yes. Yu Ling is actually the name for the imperial guard, so that is correct. And Xiang Mo Jia, there are so many that they rub against each other. Jia is really an onomatopoeic word, so it's just signifies the scratching together of their weapons, perhaps, and shields. They throng there. So, and why do the guardsmen throng there? Well, Du Fu will tell you, because it's to keep normal people out. Because what are they doing inside there? Well, he's about to tell you. Here they are feasting, and they linger in pleasures. 君臣刘欢愉, 乐动饮交阁. Also quite difficult language-wise. This, of course, not the first line. 君臣刘欢愉, but then 乐动饮交阁, thundering through empty space is Owen's translation. So the music stirs and then thunders. Yin, if you pronounce it like that, like I just did in the third tone, yin, it means it's the verb that means to thunder. But what about this? 交阁, empty space. Well, if you look at this one character at a time, 交 is glue and 阁 is a vine. So glue vine or glued together vines. What association does that bring to you? Well, this is an adjective to begin with, and the first and most basic sense that it has is to be complex or intertwined, which is not so strange. Glued together vines really cannot be described as anything else other than intertwined. But it seems that this usage, this adjective was mostly related to buildings. And thus, if you think of a huge palace complex being described in this way, of being like a complex and intertwined halls, corridors, terraces, and whatever, this word seems to have acquired the sort of secondary meaning of simply vast and deep. But my guess is still that it here refers to the whole complex of intertwined architecture that is Xuanzong's palace in Lishan. So in the empty space, it would be the space of the palace. Empty space here sounds like 交阁 could mean any empty space, like the empty space of the heaven, and I think that is probably the wrong association. Why would you describe heaven as glued together vines? That simply doesn't make sense to me. Music is thundering throughout the establishment. 次玉皆长音, 玉燕非短鹤. Here comes a bit of quite obvious social comment. 次玉, those who are granted baths, are all long hat ribbons. 长音, well, 长音, so a long hat ribbon, that would have been a traditional marker of the most prominent court officers. So the background here is, as you might guess, that the emperor would grant certain men the privilege of taking the waters at the Lishan Springs. And they are only the very cream of the crop, so people who wear short homespun tunics, 短鹤, they are not to be seen here. They don't join in the feast, 御宴. 次玉皆长音, 御宴非短鹤. And of course, that's also why you need to keep away the populace by means of the royal guard and so on. But Du Fu goes one step further in his thoughts. 同庭所分帛，本自韩女出. So he starts thinking about the various gifts that are presented to the guests of the emperor. 同庭 being the royal court. Yes, Tong is red, so the Tongting would be a court decorated with or made in a red color. And this Tong, this character, is really very frequently connected with the emperor. And here, as is seen, it really means just the imperial court, Tongting. And the silk that is apportioned here, where does it come from? Well, of course, the emperor hasn't spun it himself. It comes from the homes of poor women, 韩女, 韩女, cold women, 韩女 are poor women, 韩士, poor men. So 韩 frequently means poor or someone who is not of low social standing and no financial resources. And what have they done to the poor women in order to get the silk bolts out of them? 鞭挞其夫家，聚敛共成阙. Well, he's really laying it on here, Du Fu. He is not impressed with what has with the ways of the empire, specifically the taxes. And that is always, I think, a very good marker in a poet or philosopher in general. If they realize that the state should not misuse its power of appropriating the resources of its subjects. And that is all something that really comes back quite a lot in Du Fu's poems and of course in general in Chinese poetry. So they were very aware of that. 鞭挞其夫家，聚敛共成阙. 夫家, the menfolk, the man in the house, 夫家, yeah. 聚敛, both of these characters mean to gather, basically. Gather, 聚 more in a sort of intransitive sense and 敛 in a transitive sense. But 聚敛, 敛 also, it has the general sense of to gather, but it's often specifically used in the sense to tax. So they gather taxes and take it to the 城阙. To the palace, yeah, 城阙 literally is the wall and gate tower, so it could be the palace or the capital perhaps, but to the emperor, of course, is the final implication. 圣人匡斐恩，使欲邦国火。圣人匡斐恩, what is this? His Majesty's gracious gifts of baskets. His grace of baskets. What is the grace of baskets? Well, 匡斐, these are, yes, it's vessels made of bamboo. And these baskets, they would contain gifts from the royal court. So that's what 匡斐恩 means. And 圣人, yes, is the emperor. They are, in truth, given because the emperor wishes his domains to live, preserve, the Owen says, but make them live, really. 活. And Du Fu goes on, 君臣, that 臣如乎治理, 君起弃此物, 臣如乎治理, 君起弃此物. If the courtiers, if the ministers ignore or are unaware of or disregard the highest principles, would be perhaps the most literal translations. Perfect government, of course, is a perfectly good translation. The highest principles. Does that mean that the ruler should do away with this? 君起弃此物, should he just do away with this ritual or this practice? Or 君起弃此物, of course, you can understand it. Does that mean that he just wastes these things? Of course not. It's all the minister's fault. It's not the emperor's fault. I think Owen's translation is good here. If courtiers disregard perfect government, it is not that our prince throws these things away. This kind of really underhanded praise of the emperor, or sort of a too obvious way of deflecting the responsibility from the emperor to the courtiers or ministers. This is something I think that's very common in Chinese literature, Chinese poetry, Chinese manners. No one really falls for it, but it's sort of the way that you have to talk. It's the way you have to, it's the standpoint that you have to locate your rhetoric in if you are going to criticize the emperor. And that's what Du Fu does here. So if you just look at this literally, he's taken the responsibility away from the emperor, but of course in reality that's not the point. I mean, their point is that the corruption goes all the way up. 多事迎朝廷，仁者以战立。战速应该是吧？战立，sorry. No, that's the 立, that's not 速, that's 战立。多事迎朝廷，仁者以战立。多事, I mean, vocabulary-wise, this 多事 is very ancient. It occurs many times in the Shi Jing, for example. 济济多事, and so on. Many gentlemen, the officers. Yes, what should all these people that fill the court, what should be their reaction when they see corruption going on like this? The whole, I mean, you know, to Du Fu, it's not just corruption that unworthy people are given gifts by the emperor. Corruption is a more general phenomenon. Corruption is the whole phenomenon of the emperor and the state apparatus not serving so much as parasiting on the common people. And what should a 仁者, what should a kindly man, what should a man of benevolence think when he sees something like that? Well, he should tremble. 以战立, he should tremble in fear, because he knows that if this kind of corruption is going on, if the government is not established on a basis of virtue, then everything will go to hell. And it has always been like that, and it will always be like that. It has been like that in ancient history, and it is like that today. They also perhaps should tremble because they have a lot of responsibility to set things straight. It's a very sobering line, this last line, 仁者以战立, and terrifying, really, in its simplicity, I think. But that's not enough. You know, what we've heard so far is not enough. 况闻内金盘，尽在未获释. What's this? 况闻内金盘, the golden plate of the household. It's really the utensils for the use of the emperor. 内 here signifies that it's the palace of the emperor. The golden palace of the inner golden the inner golden plates, the inner golden utensils. Yeah, the plate of the household. They are now where? Well, they're in the hands or the homes of imperial in-laws, Owen translates, which is good translation, but it literally says Wei and Huo, and this is an allusion back to the Han Dynasty. It refers to two generals of the names of Wei Qing and Huo Qubing. So, as I said, they were generals of the early Han Dynasty. Wei Qing, he was the half-brother of Emperor Wu's favorite concubine. So Emperor Wu had a favorite concubine, and he was sort of her brother. And Huo Qubing was, in his turn, he was a younger relative of Wei Qing. And both of these men, they were really raised from the servant class. I mean, they didn't have any background or anything to begin with. They were raised from the servant class simply because of their relation to a woman that was favored by the emperor. And this is if you are situate yourself in the Tang Dynasty, this is an obvious parallel to the improper use of power wielded by the Yang clan. The Yang clan, chief of whom was Yang Guozhong, who was chancellor at this point. And Yang Guozhong, he was a completely incompetent person, but he was a chancellor simply because he was related to Yang Guifei, who was the favorite concubine again of Tang Xuanzong, the emperor. So they would mooch away with all the resources and everything that's valuable in the imperial household. They would eat out the structure from the inside. So Du Fu, he said at one point in the beginning of this poem that it's not that I believe that there is anything missing in the structure of government, or perhaps not, there's nothing missing, but the whole structure in itself has been eaten out by these vermin that fill it up. So obviously that is his true opinion, because he states it very clearly here that this is a problem. He goes on to describe what happens inside the palace. And it's so interesting, this is supposed to be a travel poem, but now everything that he talks about here really happens really just in his mind's eye. So when he must have had quite interesting travels, but we will also find out when we get to the end of this poem that he has his reasons for being in a very upset mood, and probably the things that he saw on his way was set to fire by the spark of what he found when he came home and met his wife and everything like that. And we will save that for later. But what's important here is that he really just describes things that he thinks goes on in the imperial palace. 中堂五神仙，烟雾蒙玉质. So 神仙, goddesses dance. Yeah, goddesses and immortals dance in the hall. The dances, the middle halls, 中堂, in the midst of halls, in the middle halls, yes. And 烟雾蒙玉质, diaphanous mists, well, just mists, really. I think this has to refer to the dancers' light clothing, really. I mean, it can't literally be smoke. This clothing like smoke covers jade material, literally, right? Jade material. But of course, the material is their flesh, is the flesh of the dancers. And I think marble gives us perhaps a little bit of a wrong association. It's not marble as in hard and chiseled, it's jade as in white. That's the association that we should have, like really pale jade. And that's what the skin, the milky skin of the dancers look like. 暖客雕鼠裘，杯管煮青色. How do they get warm? Where do they get their warmth from? The guests, they get it from sable, of course. 雕鼠, sable is a small little animal with a very nice fur, and they made cloaks of this. So 裘, yeah, 裘 is a cloak or a jacket made of skin or fur. 杯管煮青色, yes, sad pipes and clear zithers, nothing strange there. And what do they eat then? Well, of course, they eat really strange things. 劝客驼体羹，双城压香菊. Yeah, so they eat camel hoof stew. Sounds delicious, really. I really have to try it sometime. 双城, frosty oranges. We have to remember here that, this is before the time of refrigeration, and we're in the middle of the winter. So where the heck did they get oranges and tangerines from? Well, my comments say that apparently there is a citrus in Sichuan which bears fruit even in winter. So this may refer to that, perhaps. In a way, they eat things that normal people wouldn't eat, that are very exclusive and delicious. But 朱门酒肉臭，路有冻死骨. And here, more obvious social commentary. Crimson gates, the gates and residences of the rich. Yeah, the gates, 朱门, the red gates. So again, 通庭, the red courts, and 朱门, the red gates. These are the gates of the rich. Meat is going to waste. Meat and wine is going to waste while people die of cold in the streets. There's no poetic flourishes are necessary here, and there's no need to explain this or paraphrase it for the understanding of the viewer. Everyone understands what this means. This is really the heart of Du Fu's social commentary, and we have to remember he started off by comparing himself to Ji and Xie, Hou, Ji and Xie, the greatest ministers of mythological antiquity. And it is very, very obvious from many, many places in Du Fu's poetic oeuvre that what he really thinks the proper characteristic of a ruler and the ruling class in general is compassion and benevolence for the common people. And that is what he himself is so preeminent in. He's perhaps a genius of compassion as much as he is a genius of poetic expression. And that is part of the reason why he thought so highly of himself, but it's also part of the reason why posterity thinks so highly of him. 荣枯咫尺意，惆怅难再述。荣枯咫尺意. This is also a great line, and it's also really the culmination of this part of the poem. The stark contrast of people dying of cold in the winter and these corrupt nobles feasting in the presence of the emperor. That's everything we need to know, really, in Du Fu's mind about what's wrong with the empire. When we realize, when we get here, the condemnation of everything, that he has recounted so far, and his wish to set all of this right, which, of course, we also know from his self-portrayal, which we went through in the first part of this analysis. And the first part of the analysis ended with that he said that he breaks into song and is so terribly sad. And now he's back on this theme. He's so upset, 惆怅. He's so desperately upset and emotionally agitated by this, that it's hard to keep on talking and recounting. And even the third part of this poem will end in on a similar kind of refrain. So I will stop here for the second time, and then I will go through the third part of the poem in the third video of this series. Thank you for listening, and bye.